Welcome to our second session. Yeah. Welcome to our second session on due diligence for nonprofits. So those who are part of the first session would know that we focused on financial due diligence as part of our first session. We spoke about financial due diligence across different phases of donor engagement, right from pre-grant to during grant and post-grant. So today we actually take a step back and just focus on the due diligence component that a donor is looking for prior to giving a grant. So the Satwa team did touch upon this briefly, but the team here today will delve a little bit more into deep and help you understand the pre-grant due diligence requirements holistically. So the agenda for today's session, are you able to hear me? Ashwini, can you just confirm if you're able to hear me?
Yeah, you're audible, Meenu.
Okay.
We can hear you, Meenu.
Ashwini, if you can just move to the next slide. So today, the team here will be covering the scope for the session and then focusing on two critical aspects. One is the organization due diligence and second is the program due diligence. Then we'll also take you through a couple of templates and we'll be then opening the floor up for Q&A. Like always, request you all to share any questions that you have over the chat. We'll take it up during the Q&A. So excited to welcome Uday, Khanna, and Sakshi Alawat to the session today. Both of them are part of the CSR corporate advisory team within Satwa. So Uday has engaged with multiple corporate clients within Satwa, been anchoring the end-to-end management of their CSR portfolios. He's also building the internal knowledge management system at Satwa and really focusing on building a due diligence product for the nonprofit in itself. Uday has a master's in mathematics from St. Stephen's and has multidisciplinary research experience. Welcome Uday to this session. And Sakshi, again, like Uday has been working on developing programs for corporates in livelihood healthcare sector. And she again is part of the corporate team and been engaged in multiple projects doing due diligence for a lot of NGOs across the project. Prior to Satwa, she has worked with corporate foundations to provide public health support to rural and urban India, along with advocacy for people with disability. She holds an MSW from CIS, Mumbai, and is a certified CSR professional. Both of you, welcome to this session. I'm handing it over to you to kind of take it off. Thank you.
Thanks, Meenu. I just wanted to check quickly. I hope my voice is audible. I hope it's clear. I hope everybody can hear me. If I can get a thumbs up from anyone, that would be great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ashwini, if we can move to the next slide, please. Yeah, just the next slide, please. Okay. So the scope of this session, like Meenu suggested, would be to take a step back. What we want to do in today's session is understand due diligence process, broadly speaking. When we say due diligence, what we essentially mean is that an organization is being evaluated by a donor or a partner organization for any kind of work or sort of engagement that the organization is being evaluated for. This can be, say, a corporate comes to you for a potential employee volunteering engagement they want to do with you. For example, a corporate may reach out to you or a foundation may reach out to you to provide you grant money to conduct a project, be it in healthcare or any relevant sector that you may be working in. So what we essentially mean by due diligence is the exercise of selection of an organization, assessment of an organization for the purpose of selection for any kind of work that a partner organization may be reaching out to you for. And the key areas of discussion today for us will be to understand what sort of things are being assessed in such an exercise. And although we may have some sort of bias towards, some sort of focus towards how corporates are conducting due diligence processes, our general principles, which will be discussed today, might be applicable in various other scenarios, various other kind of donors, be it foundations, international organizations. What we want to look at today is understand what are the areas of evaluation, why they matter, understand them in detail in terms of particular case studies, which we have discussed, and we want to do it in a very interactive way today with you. And those gaps which we'll identify in our case studies, which we discussed today, we also want to leave you with some best practices. How could those gaps be identified and mitigated? What information could someone have provided? How could you better communicate that, yes, you do have the XYZ information, you do have that execution capability, you do have those sort of governance systems in place. Sometimes the gap is not just about an organization having that ability. Sometimes it's about communicating that through this exercise. And hence, understanding this exercise becomes particularly important for any sort of engagement that you may be part of. Can you move to the next section, please, Ashwani? Right. So to facilitate today's discussion, we've broken down due diligence into two components. Can you move ahead, Ashwani, please? So like Meenu said, organizational due diligence. By organizational due diligence, what we mean is, if you think of a web page of any non-profit, you may be familiar with sections such as who we are and how we work. So an organizational due diligence is an assessment of all things about the organization and not necessarily about any project or program that you may be doing. However, if you think about the section which is usually on those web pages which say what we do, so all the things about a particular project or a program, once those are being assessed, that kind of assessment we are calling a programmatic due diligence. While I'll be taking you through the organizational due diligence component, Sakshi will be taking you through the programmatic due diligence component in the second half. We can move on, Ashwini. Okay. So firstly, we want to also quickly give you an overview of what all sorts of modes due diligence can present itself in. How a donor, whether it's a corporate or a foundation, an international organization, how a donor may be engaging with you, may be conducting a due diligence exercise may vary quite significantly. And it is in the best interest of an organization to be well prepared for all sorts of possible scenarios. Some common scenarios of due diligence, which we mentioned on the left-hand side, are when a donor directly reaches out to you, somebody from the donor agency will reach out to you and connect with you to conduct a due diligence exercise, to talk to you, to figure out if they can partner with you in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes donors hire external organizations to reach out to you on their behalf and conduct a due diligence externally. There are also scenarios where certain organizations set out a call for an RFP. You come to us and you give us a proposal. You fill out this, you fill out this form and you apply to our processes. And a similar process occurs in case of, for example, platforms such as Give India or Mila. These funding portals exist where you can reach out to them and advertise potential opportunities. However, to be admitted to those platforms to begin with, there is a due diligence process with those organizations also take up. So these are all potential scenarios of due diligence which can occur. However, the ways in which data can be requested from you is what you see on your right-hand side of the screen. When we say desk evaluation via secondary research, what that means is an organization was the donor party did not even get in touch with the organization. All the information which may be available on your website, which may be available in past records in other sort of online platforms, can be used to conduct the due diligence of an organization without ever reaching out to them. However, a desk evaluation or due diligence process can also include an organization reaching out to you or procuring some data from your organization. It may also include surveys of your past stakeholders, your past donors, any other stakeholders when we say stakeholders, it can also include those which may not have been donating to you, but for example, they partnered with you for an employee volunteering exercise, or maybe you were a research advisor on a certain project. Those sort of engagements can also be considered as your potential stakeholders. Meeting with an org leadership. Now, not just org leadership, but when organizations reach out to you, set up meetings, set up calls, these can be virtual or in person, to understand your organization better. Those sort of activities are also methodologies of data collection. And those can also feed into a due diligence exercise that is being conducted. And lastly, field visits. Field visits of your projects can be one of the components of the due diligence of, for example, your programmatic due diligence in particular. You can move on, Ashwini. So the grander point, what we were trying to highlight was, ideally, every organization should be well aware of the ways data can be collected and should be able to facilitate those modes of due diligence. The key reasons why we're doing due diligence essentially is to establish trust with an organization, to identify risks for any sort of donor agency, and to more or less assess whether whatever the reason may be, whether it's employee volunteering, whether it's you being a sectoral expert or research expert in a project, whether you being an implementation agency for a CSR project, whatever the purpose may be, they also want to assess your fitment or your capability. So broadly speaking, you can say a due diligence exercise is assessing the credibility and capability of an organization. However, at an organizational due diligence level, there are certain focus areas which, like we've mentioned here, are non-exhaustive in nature. The three which you see currently on this slide are compliance, reputation of an organization, and transparency of its operations. Under compliance, an organization may be evaluated for its CSR compliance, its FCRA compliance. An organization, political and religious affiliations may be evaluated as well under compliance. Similarly, under reputation, your reputation can be determined via assessment of various aspects, such as your presence in media. This can include not just the news media, news articles about you, but also your social media presence, your website. Furthermore, your reputation can be assessed by any sort of achievements and accreditations that you may have. Your reputation can also be assessed from, for example, whether your organization's leadership has been invited to various impact forums. That can also be an assessment area of reputation. And lastly, on this slide, you see transparency. So how are you communicating your operations, your activities to the public? This can be done via modes of annual reports. And similarly, in terms of financial transparency, this is done via your balance sheets. So you may have your annual reports, you may have your balance sheets, but are those readily available? Have you, are your annual reports and balance sheets for the previous years publicly available on your website? What about your FC receipts? What about your FCRA foreign contribution receipts? A level of transparency to the public in, for example, in a secondary research mode of due diligence is quite critical. Because say if an organization or a donor agency is not even connecting with you to ask you whether or not you have an annual report, and they're just visiting your website, even if you had that document, because you've not shared it, because your transparency may be lacking, that may be an assessment area which negatively affects your evaluation at that stage. You can move on, Ashwini, to the next section. Right. The next three areas which we also have highlighted for you are governance, execution capabilities, and ecosystem engagement. When we say governance, what we think about is like a skeleton of an organization. So execution capabilities, an organization's reputation, these are components of an organization that we can broadly understand. However, governance structures within an organization, how decisions about the organization at an organization level are made, what are the processes which are set up which guide all decision making, executive decision making within an organization, what sort of policies exist within the organization to control, to uh, to guide how an organization operates. All of that is dictated by the governance structure, and hence, excuse me, um, and hence it becomes quite critical as an assessment area under an organizational due diligence. And some of the assessment areas which we mentioned are also effectiveness of your organization's board, how well functioning your board is, how frequently do they engage, do you maintain your board notes from your relevant board meetings, what is the composition of your board committee. Similarly, organizational policies, whether you have an HR policy, whether you have a code of ethics which guides how your organization operates. Those sort of things are assessment areas under the governance component of an organizational due diligence. Execution capabilities, I believe, will be something that is of paramount importance, right? How you work, how do you monitor and evaluate your projects? What are your capabilities in terms of monitoring the financials of your project? Those are areas of assessments which can directly impact the kind of work an organization may be reaching out to you for, be it employee volunteering opportunities, be it they want to find they want to partner with you for a CSR grant. They would have to have a significant amount of trust in your ability to execute the kind of project that they want you to execute. And hence, that becomes another key focus area. And lastly, ecosystem engagement. So how does your organization interact with other similar organizations in the social impact ecosystem? This becomes a key area of due diligence, particularly because ecosystem engagement in a way also adds to your reputation. And having a reputed organization doing the work on your behalf, for example, in case of an implement agency donor model, that's just a sign of trust. And that's essentially the key principle here. When we assess, for example, governance, when we assess, for example, compliance, we may be looking at reducing risks, identifying and reducing risks of partnering with your organization. Similarly, when we are trying to understand execution capability, we are trying to assess, a donor is trying to assess what they are reaching out to you for, what they may be reaching out to you for, whether you have the capability itself to be able to deliver. And lastly, when we're looking at ecosystem engagement, when we're looking at reputation, those are assessment broad areas which sort of build trust. Any donor who is coming out at you for the first time, trust assessment, a risk assessment, and essentially a capability assessment become three major sections of the due diligence activity which is happening at an org level. I'll just pause here. Any questions which have been raised regarding organizational due diligence, some of the sections which we've talked about, and also some of the assessment areas which we've highlighted, which are basically assessment areas under that very governance section itself. To elaborate, essentially say you may have a focus area, right? Governance is a very broad section, and the avenues of assessing governance may be through some of these assessment areas. So like we've highlighted, and I want to reiterate, no, it's this, what you see in front of you is not an exhaustive list of assessment areas. And depending on a donor's perspective, some assessment areas may be more important than others. And while some assessment areas may be make or break, for example, say it's in case of compliance, a lot of the things are make or break sort of assessment areas. For example, CSR compliance, 12AB and 8TG registration certificates. Similarly, for example, if a corporate has an internal policy to not partner with any organization which has religious affiliations, they may take that stand. And that internal policy implies that that may be a deal breaker for them. And that implies that is a make or break criteria for this particular donor, but probably not for any other donor, potentially. So that's basically essentially the organizational due diligence, the potential focus areas that can be under that, and some of the assessment areas that we can talk about. I believe we'll also be sharing this document with you, so you can further deep dive into what is the rationale which we've highlighted here. What is the donor's perspective when they're asking you these things, when they're assessing these certain areas. But I'll just like to take a pause here and entertain any questions that may be, particularly for this section.
Request participants, if you have questions, please put it on the chat, or you could also unmute yourself.
Okay, sure. So we'll continue to address the questions. We can take them up later at the end of the session as well. We allocated dedicated time for that. But the key area here, now what we're getting into is the case study section of organizational due diligence. So if you can move, Ashwini, to the next slide, please. Right. So now what we want to do, if we understand what organizational due diligence means, what sort of is the area of assessment, and why we are doing it. If we think about it from that perspective, that we're trying to establish trust, that a donor is trying to establish trust, a donor is trying to identify potential risks of partnering with our organization, and a donor is trying to assess whether or not you will be able to deliver what they plan to work with you for. If we keep those three key tenets in mind, can we look at the findings of a potential due diligence exercise that a corporate has done on ABC Foundation and see if together we can identify any sort of risk that a donor may perceive as a potential risk, as a potential gap, which may lead to ABC Foundation not being selected by that corporate for a potential CSR grant. So what you see in front of you is the key findings from the organizational due diligence, which was conducted for ABC Foundation by a corporate. Let us take one specific finding in particular, and I want to open the floor for any of you to please go ahead, whether you want to type in the chat or whether you want to unmute and speak yourself. We would like to highlight, we would like to see and identify from a donor's perspective what could be a potential risk in partnering with ABC Foundation. So if I'd like to bring your attention to the compliance and governance section, point number 2. So ABC Foundation has an executive committee of 6 members. They are responsible for all executive decision making of the organization. Now, the organization was founded by Mr. and Mrs. Sharma, who are part of that 6-member committee. So this talks about how is the board structured, who are the key members, and what is the relationship between the 2 founding members. What do you think is a potential gap or a potential risk according to a donor in this sort of a board composition?
It would be great if the participants can either put your responses on the chat and or comment. Unmute yourself and comment.
Yeah, so and whenever it is coming the complaints part, no, if the organizations don't have and ULA, so they have to pay just income tax to the government, and so it is and for the donor point of view, it is a risk to the donor. because the donor money will be utilized as a tax amount to the government. This is one of the risk when we don't have the toll certificate. This is the thing. Second thing, if you don't have a CSR things, no. So most of the CSR or CSR foundation, they will not support to us, because if they will give money to us also, they will not get that CSR exemptions and from Minister of Corporate Affairs.
Correct.
Third point, one is that, and it is related to and post and prevention of sexual harassment policy.
Okay.
If it in our HR policy, if you don't have this and prevention of how to prevent sexual harassment policy at the workplace, no. So it is a risk to the it is like a internal risk as well as a donor point of view. If any internal risk will come related to the sexual harassment, no. So the donor will also blame how they will select this type of partners. So that way, and that point will come under compliance and governance. Thank you.
Exactly. Completely agreed. So, like you mentioned, Bhimrao, whether if an organization does not have an ATG certificate, that would, even if it's not currently valid, that would imply that they're not eligible as per law to conduct CSR activities. And as I mentioned, this corporate in particular is reaching out to ABC Foundation to figure out whether they can provide them a CSR grant. Secondly, like you mentioned, if an organization does not have a POSH policy, prevention of sexual harassment policy, then, like you mentioned, while it's a critical internal risk for the organization, any partner organization, any donor agency is also at risk because their reputation is also on the line. If they support you via a grant and they are mentioned as your potential, as your donors, as your partners, and for example, imagine a news media article which mentions that ABC Foundation has had sexual harassment cases filed against it via its organization members, and ABC Foundation has been supported by our corporate. Then that is definitely a reputational risk for our corporate as well, like you rightly highlighted. Secondly, I also see Vekanji from Siva Trust, who has highlighted that they are related to each other. Correct. So, Mr. Vekanji, would you like to elaborate? You're right that the gap is that two board members are related to each other. But why is that a risk to the donor? What is the actual problem associated with it? Would you like to elaborate on that further? Correct.
Venkatji, do you want to pick up on the point that you have said they are related to each other within the board and what's the contribution there?
Okay, perhaps Vekanji isn't here. I can to close that. He's right. Essentially, the problem is that ABC Foundation has 6 board members, out of which 2 are related to each other. In terms of executive decision making, 2 out of 6 of your board members being related to each other implies that 2 out of 6 of your board members are not potentially not taking decisions individually. So the effectiveness of your board is essentially reduced because your board members are not functioning independently. That's the risk. Board members' leadership leads to key decision making in the organization. And hence, a donor may not have confidence in your organization's capabilities if its board composition is such that the board members are not able to function independently. That's why relations between board members becomes a challenge. I also see some other responses here. We'll take a few more before we move on to the next section where we can discuss about some of these challenges in detail. Code of ethics. So Doyleji says code of ethics and the HR policies are not set, and hence they will be perceived as a less credible organization. I completely agree with you on that. To be more specific, code of ethics and HR policies would be considered absence of them would be considered gaps in the governance of an organization. Like I mentioned, these would be considered as some key policy documents which should exist and guide how an organization should essentially function. Niharika ji mentions that, oh, this is regarding the composition of board members only. There could be change in dynamics of the committee in absence of one or both of them. I perhaps will get back to that. Government stakeholders, Ishwar Balaji says. Sorry, Meenu, you were saying something.
Just do you want to check that Niharika, she wants to elaborate?
Sorry, Meenu, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat it, sir?
Sorry, I was just
Yeah,
asking, do you
because
want
this
Niharika-
point I'm not getting that the organization has a flagship program and can create unique framework for assessment. However, has not registered them as a IPS. IPS means individual persons or what? IPS.
Intellectual properties.
Okay, intellectual property. Okay.
So essentially, ABC Foundation has created a lot of unique frameworks. Like they've built out their own assessment methods, for example, and they've documented them via creating these unique frameworks which they can use for assessment of their projects. However, these are not copyrighted or trademarked as owned by ABC Foundation. That's the point which is mentioned under ecosystem engagement.
Yeah, I got it.
Since we're discussing about it, the potential risk, I would say the potential gap here is, if ABC Foundation were to have ownership of these, have intellectual property, have these not just as unique frameworks, but also have them as intellectual property that adds to the reputation of the organization. It's essentially part of them having positive ecosystem engagement, since they are not just doing work, they're also adding to the knowledge of how the work needs to be done, should be done. They're creating innovative solutions, and that's a huge value addition to the ecosystem. So this foundation, ABC Foundation, will be seen, had they had intellectual property, like registered intellectual property, these frameworks of assessment, had they actually had them of their own in terms of ownership, that would have had a huge boost towards their reputation, as well as their they would have had, a donor may have seen that and perceived them as an organization who wants to have a really strong and positive impact in the space that they work in particular. Yes, I believe Pradeep ji, you're trying to say something. Okay, I'll just take one more and then we can move on. Ishwar Balaji says government stakeholders connects should be checked further. If it has a political angle, then there is a risk. That is fair. So like we highlighted, some organizations may have policies internally to not partner with organizations which have political affiliations. There are also some aspects with regards to FCRA funding, foreign funding, wherein an organization, whether they have, for example, that foreign funding cannot be redirected towards political parties. Also, foreign funding should ideally not be provided to an active public servant. In our case, Mrs. Sharma is an active member of the Indian Army and closely works with government student holders. Since she's an active member of the Indian Army, that would imply that she's an active public servant. And as per FCRA regulations, this might be a challenge. If a foreign funding is to be provided by our corporate to ABC Foundation, then there may be a compliance risk associated to FCRA regulations as well. But correct, political affiliations may be a challenge, primarily from the point of view of a corporate or a funder having a certain policy of how treatment of such politically affiliated organizations should be. Okay, I would like to move on and we can take some of these discussion points in particular and also discuss for the very specific ones that perhaps we discussed today. I would like to discuss what sort of documentation, what sort of best practices are present that an organization can take up to perhaps mitigate these as risks. So, Ashwini, I would request you to move to the next slide, please. Okay. So, as we discussed, since ABC is not a CSR, ABC will not be considered CSR eligible until the ATG certification is renewed. One of the best practices that we may recommend is to ensure you track all notifications by these relevant government authorities. Like I believe Mr. Bhimrao was the one who mentioned that that MCA, MHA, and other organizations have particular compliances for which this becomes a compliance risk to our donor. In that spirit, it would be recommended that we ensure that we keep track of all notifications from these particular government organizations, these rule-making bodies, to ensure that we keep our compliance up to date with the most recent developments in the compliance space. Secondly, I believe we also discussed that the board members are related to each other. Now, in case of ABC Foundation, Mr. and Mrs. Sharma were husband and wife related to each other, and also not only founders but also board members of that 6-member committee. Ideally, an organization can ensure that no familial relations exist within their board members. Furthermore, they can also consider hiring or in bringing in leadership board members of the organization externally, and those board members can not only add to the credibility, but given their past experience in other sectors and other spaces, they might also bring some unique capabilities along with them and add to the overall capability of an organization as well. One more interesting point that perhaps we can take a look at was, if you can you go back, Ashwini, just for 1 second to the previous slide. So if you see under reputability, point number 2, in 2019, some members of Deoband village alleged that ABC Foundation took false credit of reforestation of their land. ABC Foundation clarified that they had implemented a CSR project supported by a donor Y and have completed the outlined scope of activities. So, you can go back to the next slide, Ashwini. So, if you see, the organization in our case did clarify that they conducted activities as per an MOU, and perhaps there were misunderstandings between the community and the organization that was ABC Foundation. However, if such a similar case occurs again when this particular corporate is engaged, that may be perceived by that donor as a reputation risk to them. What ABC Foundation could have done is, one, have dedicated personnel towards public relations. So this can ensure that these project achievements, all the communication which an organization does towards the external, towards the public, essentially gets checked and vetted by a professional who can potentially mitigate these risks. And we must also ensure that information that you provide, whether it's on your website, whether it's on social media, we must ensure that all information provided by an organization is accurate. Accuracy of data provided externally becomes quite critical, particularly in cases where secondary research is being conducted on your organization to assess your organization. We can go to the next slide, Ashwini. So, as I just wanted to reiterate in case some of us have joined us in the interim of the discussion, we will be sharing this deck with you post the call as well, wherein you can also use this case study as a potential learning tool for your relevant organizational personnel as well. Some of the other gaps and risks in this particular case of ABC Foundation, which we had discussed, were regarding their ecosystem engagement. So, and the donor may perceive the organization to not be a key player in the social impact space, to not be sharing its learnings within the ecosystem. And as you see on the bottom right, one of the best practices for mitigating that particular risk would have been to register that unique framework, that assessment tool, as intellectual property of the organization. Not only to share its learnings, but it can also be a unique appeal of the organization to its donors. The organization can also adopt frameworks developed by other organizations, other entities in the ecosystem, which are being recognized. For example, say you are doing early childhood care and development focus projects. There may exist frameworks which are recognized and developed by organizations such as UNICEF, which can be adopted by your organization and used for implementation. These sort of collaborations between your organization and other organizations with relevant areas of operation may be signs of positive ecosystem engagement. And those can be also interpreted as positive additions to the credibility of your organization. I'll just take a pause here. I understand that we covered a lot of information in this discussion. Any questions that you would like to have me address, particularly of some of the gaps and risks we talked about for ABC Foundation?
Uday, if I may just come in here, Minu here. So I think there were two questions earlier on which did not get addressed. One was around the point under transparency section where it was mentioned 2 people team for financial management and 2 donors accounting for 90% of the funds. So I think Soumya wanted to understand the implication of this, on the overall business.
Okay, sure. So Ashwini, can we go back to the case study itself? Right. So no, it's the slide after. Yes. So if you see on the right hand side, under transparency and execution capability, in case of ABC Foundation,
I'm not sure if it's the 4th point. I think Soumya has mentioned 3rd point, so it's probably on the MS Office tool. Soumya, if you want to come in and talk about it, that also works. I think it's the point on the MS Office tool. The organization is the first point.
Okay. So the first part of the 3rd point under transparency. Okay. So the organization currently uses MS Office tools such as Word and Excel, and the organization has a project plan detailed with timelines. Got it. So essentially, if you, I'm so sorry, an organization which is currently using is currently using tech-enabled M&E monitoring and evaluation methods is definitely a plus. Tech-enabled monitoring and evaluation can build a lot of efficiency in your M&E processes, and hence this is definitely a positive that the organization is monitoring its process, monitoring its projects via tools such as those offered by MS Office. However, they can also use medium to advanced tech-enabled MIS systems, whether, for example, it's for managing your financials or whether it is to monitoring your projects, data, even conducting surveys. There exist various specialized tools to conduct, to be used for all of these M&E processes that may need to be taken up. So although a donor may assess that it's a positive that the organization conducts its M&E via tech-enabled tools, they will see a scope for the organization to use medium to advanced tech-enabled tools, particularly in cases of projects which will definitely benefit a lot from it. To take an example, say you were doing a large-scale survey in a rural district, and say you could use an app which can allow you to conduct a survey in that district and directly and immediately track it in a central in a central hub, in a platform online, that would be a huge value addition, because that may allow you to first monitor your surveyors. You will be able to see who was where at what home at when, and when were these components taken. So it adds to the credibility of your survey, it adds to the efficiency of your survey. And however, if you take that same example and consider a tool such as MS Office, there are limitations to such a tool when you're designing a survey. And not only are there efficiency lackings, but the data collection process may have higher number of errors, because a specialized tool solely made for survey collection is optimized to be used for that very specific task. So I believe that essentially answers how this may be perceived as a gap, not necessarily a risk, but definitely as a gap in the organization's execution capabilities.
Sir, maybe sir, like no, if they are preparing their financial like transactions and everything in MS Word or in MS Excel, that may be a big weakness, maybe that may be a big gap rather than survey. I think that maybe is a correct answer for third point. And sir, and the fourth one, no, if the organization is completely depend upon two donors, means dependence syndrome is more high. So that point will come.
Definitely. So very valid points. In fact, conducting financial management via such uh, basic tech tools, like you highlighted, may be a gap in execution capabilities that may be assessed by a donor. Further, like you mentioned, having dependency on just two donors for the significant proportion of your budget may be a challenge in terms of financial sustainability of the organization. It would be recommended as a best practice that the organization should have a diverse set of donors, and number of donors, but potentially even a diverse sources of funding. For example, not just solely depending on, for example, CSR grants, but also having other avenues of fundraising, which are being considered to ensure that the organization remains financially sustainable.
Just one last question, and probably we can move on to the next question. So this is on policy. So still not having policies like purchase policy or recruitment policy in place, will that affect the way organization is evaluated for capability or credibility?
So purchase policy and recruitment policies, will that affect? Okay, so this may be considered under equivalent to, for example, point number 4. So purchase policy might be something under a code of ethics itself. How you have defined purchasing of or procurement methods might be the code of ethics equivalent. Similarly, hiring policy might be something which is considered under what we've called an HR policy. So yes, these will be considered as, these will be assessed as gaps by a donor and will have a negative connotation associated to your credibility, as well as in some sense capability, because governance in some sense affects both credibility and capability of an organization. I hope I have sufficiently answered that question. Sure.
Do you want to move on to the next section of that, just in the interest?
Yes, please. Yes, please. So now Sakshi will take over and take you through the programmatic due diligence. The structure of our discussion will remain the same, where we want to introduce you to what may come under programmatic due diligence and also take you through an interactive case study, just like we did in case of an organizational due diligence. Over to you, Sakshi.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for taking out the time and interacting with us right now. Like Uday said, the pattern is going to be similar to what we've done for the organizational due diligence part. Ashwini, can we please move on to the next slide? So when we're talking about programmatic due diligence, it's it goes in sync with the organizational due diligence in terms of, due diligence as a whole. Due diligence needs to be looked at as a whole, right? So there is no way that you can qualify in the organizational due diligence bit, and there is no way that you can fail in the programmatic due diligence bit but be selected as a partner. So when we're saying that we're going to conduct due diligence, we need to ensure that there is a certain criteria and certain level we are meeting for the programmatic due diligence as well as the organizational due diligence. So when we're looking at organizational due diligence, what we're focusing on is the program efficiency. There are different aspects that we look at, but one of the focus areas, like we mentioned on this slide, is program efficiency and reporting. So when we're looking at program efficiency, what we're largely focusing on and looking at in a proposal is how efficiently the program has been planned and detailed out in the proposal. For example, has the methodology of what is going to be, what change is expected from the program has been detailed out clearly, right? So that can be done in largely two aspects, wherein you detail out the theory of change and you focus on the logical framework analysis. What we mean by theory of change is just putting out the methodology that will be followed to bring about the change and ensure that the intended impact is generated. Whereas the logical framework is going to be focusing on the inputs and the activities, the outputs expected out of the activities, the outcomes expected in the medium term, and followed by the impact that we're expecting at a large level. What we also focus largely on during, analyzing the program plan is to ensure that the timelines have been defined in a way that are cognizant to what the donors are going to be expecting, right? And another very crucial point over here is going to be the program budget, because it needs to be clearly detailed out and mentioned as to, if the budget is in sync with what the project objectives are. If we have broken down each and every line item and we're able to provide a rationale to why we need the money for what we need it, right? And both the things need to be in sync with one another to be made for the donor to be able to make sense of the overall picture of what we're proposing. Similarly, for program reporting, like Uday mentioned also, that tech tools are extremely important. So when we're looking at program structure, we need to ensure that we are in sync with the donor and we are able to, provide the reporting structure that the donors are seeking for. This can be in terms of the format. If we have to, if the NGO has to provide their own reports in terms of the format that is going to be followed, or if there's going to be a prescribed format that the donor is expecting us to follow, right? What other things we look at is also the cadence alignment with the donors to ensure that if a donor is expecting a reporting structure of, let's say that they're going to be fortnightly meetings, followed by monthly reports that are going to be submitted, and biannual field visits, right? So these are the different reporting structures that can be put into place. And at the time of drafting a proposal, it's important to remember and to be in sync with what the request of proposal has put out as the boundary conditions in terms of what all is expected from us. Like I mentioned, tech tools are extremely important. I'm sure Uday also at some point has, he has definitely done a lot of due diligences, but has been at a state where he's had to reject very credible NGOs because tech tools are not available. Right. So that is one thing that needs to be taken into account when we're looking at the reporting structures. Ashwini, can we please move on to the next slide? Thank you. So when we're talking about the program relevance, what we're looking at is aspects such as geography, ensuring that there has been a need assessment conducted in the area. When we say geography, we need to ensure that the geography that we are willing to offer as an NGO is in sync with the areas that the donor wants to engage with. For example, if we are providing skilling projects, or we're able to provide, open a skilling center in, let's say, Rajasthan, but the donor requires it to be in Haryana, then there is no sync over there, right? So it doesn't quite make sense to apply for a proposal like that, unless there is a caveat in the request for proposal that says that we're open to giving you capex cost to construct a new center altogether. So when we're also looking at program relevance, what we're looking at is to ensure that there is a strategy alignment with the donor, that the intent and the outcome that we're expecting from our own projects is in sync with the impact that the donor is expecting from what they're releasing the funds for. What also plays a huge role in ensuring that the program is relevant, is going to be something that can be sustainable, is to ensure that there are aspects of innovation that are involved with our programs. So when I'm saying innovation, we can take example like, let's say we're working in the tech space, and we're providing skilling in the tech space. Then we need to ensure that we are looking at a more futuristic perspective, and we're able to provide them skill training in not just ITES, but also in artificial intelligence, or in virtual reality, so that they know that this is the upcoming thing, this is where the economy is going to incline to, and this is also where the component of conducting a thorough need assessment comes in. It's not just about the geography, but it's also about to be able to map what the future requirement is going to be, where the economy is going to lean, where the needs may arise, right? And then overall, what every donor would look for and any organization would look for is a program impact, to have clearly, like we're going to mention in our LFAs, that this is the impact we intend to create. We need to also be able to ensure that we are in a place where we can define that, listen, in short term, this is what we're aiming at, mid-term, this is what we're aiming at, and long term, this is what we're aiming at. So that the donor is able to understand and put into space key, okay, this is what we're going to, expect in, let's say, the next 6 months. This is our goal for the next 3 months. This is our goal for the next 12 months and 6 years, etc., etc. So figuring out the impact figures, ensuring that we're able to meet timelines is very crucial to ensuring that there is an overall sustainability through the program as well. And when we're talking about sustainability, it goes beyond just, the impact figures. It also goes to the extent where we're involving the community to take ownership as to what we have to offer. So like it's always said in the ecosystem that, to be able to make large scale impact, we need to ensure that the beneficiaries are equally concerned about it and are willing to have more community members involved to it. So now let's take, for example, if we're looking at sustainability, what we can do is engage the community in a way where they're willing to take not just accountability, but ownership in terms of what the outcome of the project is going to be, and they understand how much of an impact that activity is going to make to their day-to-day activities. For example, if we say that there is let's say a daycare center where people with disabilities need to be, can use services with with professionals, then we're able to charge them a minimum amount of, let's say, 50 rupees per month, wherein they understand the value of the services they are being provided, and they understand that this is going to be sustainable in the long run. Because even if the donor backs out and the donor is like, okay, fine, this is a project I do not want to fund anymore, we still have some form of funding coming in, even for an interim level, till we find another donor, to have the project running sustainably. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So these are some of the factors that we had focused on while looking at programmatic due diligence. What we're now going to focus on is a case study wherein it follows a similar format to what Uday had also discussed earlier. We have a case study over here where a corporate has released an open RFP for NGOs working in the nutrition and healthcare space. Now, the corporate has clearly said that the budget is 4.5 crores and they intend to work in the urban space of Maharashtra, Punjab, and Tamil Nadu. They have requested a monthly governance structure for smooth program management, wherein the implementing partners will be required to submit a report in a format prescribed to them, right? And whatever information that has been provided by ABC Foundation has been listed below. So it'll be great if we can take a minute or two just to walk through what has been given here and figure out if, there are aspects that you think could have been more clearly defined in the LFAs, or perhaps if there is a proper sync in the theory of change and the methodology impact they're trying to bring about. Please feel free to write down the answers in the chat box as well.
Sakshi, it may also be helpful for you to take us through this as well. If you can give us a brief overview of what they have essentially defined as, described as a opportunity, as a proposal essentially.
Yeah, sure. So what ABC Foundation is trying to do over here is to provide, because they are in the nutritional space and healthcare space, what they're focusing on is providing safety and nutrition, immunization facilities to the beneficiaries and stimulating an learning environment. So what we're understanding from this is that they're focusing on a certain age group that is largely school-going children. So what they're focusing on is improving the nutrition and health and physical development, cognitive, social, and emotional development, and the school readiness and admission processes that they can enroll for. The intended outcome that they're looking at is increased participation of mothers in labor forces, reduction in malnutrition, and reduced illnesses and school dropouts. So if we look at the case study over here, what we're able to see is that on the left hand side of the theory of change, which is the first box, it's not entirely synced to the right hand side, the last box, because there is a complete transition or shift from the target population that we're looking at and the outcome that we're looking at, because a certain age group has not been accounted for, right? So this is more of an example to engage the audience, but it'll be great if as part of the LFAs, if there's anything that you can pinpoint, what can be improved in the LFA, what cannot be, something like that. Okay, so when we're looking at the activities mentioned in the LFA, yeah, sorry, I've just noticed that there's some answers coming in.
Actually, do you want me to read the questions for you?
No, that's all right. I've opened that. Bhimrao ji has asked, what is the basic difference between TOC and LFM tools? So when we're looking at TOC is largely basically the, when we're talking about TOC, it's basically us putting across the intended impact we are looking at through the program for the community. And it's largely focusing on the methodology as to how we will arrive at that impact. So what we're focusing on over here is an overview of the activities that would be conducted in order to reach an impact. I'm not sure if you could provide me the full form of LFM tools. Uday, are you aware of this?
So I believe the question is essentially when you look at the theory of change and when you look at an LFA, given that they're both essentially frameworks, right? Both of them are frameworks and tools which define what you want to do. So what's the basic difference between them? What I would basically respond to that is a theory of change is big picture. You're talking about you're looking back and you're seeing if I do safety, nutrition, and immunization, this will lead to improvement in nutrition, health, and physical development, and which largely leads to these potential outputs and outcomes. So structurally, they may seem quite similar. The reason for that is they're both essentially frameworks which are being used to map out how you see how are you going to assess the impact. So while one may say that a theory of change is more associated to assessment of impact, and LFA might be a document which is more aligned to what is the project's plan. So an LFA is structured in certain way where you see the inputs coming in, what all you will do, when you will do it, how it will be structured, leading into the outputs. When you do these things, what will happen? What will come out of your inputs? And lastly, you lead to outcomes and even later impact. So what are the outcomes of all these outputs that are happening? And what are all these outcomes leading to as potential impact indicators? for these beneficiaries for this particular project? Please feel free to add here,
Yeah,
Sakshi. as well.
just to add to what Uday also said, when we're looking at a theory of change, we, like he mentioned, we're giving an overall picture. But when we're looking at LFA, we're expected to provide them with impact figures that we're aiming at, right? The percentage differences that we're looking at. So for example, if we look at the LFA over here, the ABC Foundation has provided us information that they're looking at age group above 6 months, right? But they have not given us an upper limit to what the age group is going to be. They have told us that they're going to do age appropriate immunization. They've told us they're going to do basic education and linkages to government schools. But when we look at the other end, which is the outcome, they have focused on increased participation in women, in mothers in labor forces. So the activity is not linked to the outcome, right? Mothers have not been mentioned in the activities anywhere, and the outcomes, the first outcome is increased mothers participation in labor force. Similarly, there is no activity that mentions that, okay, there's going to be a activity done for increasing the social protection, but somehow in the outcomes, that is something that is mentioned and highlighted. When we look at the outputs as well, they have written, the proposal mentions that there are going to be people who are going to be attending health camps and age appropriate immunization, but there is no quantifiable, or there is no number that has been provided as to what we're aiming at and what we're going to receive out of that project. So when we're looking at an LFA, we need to ensure that we're, providing quantifiable figures and outputs. The outcomes can be quantifiable in terms of what is the medium-term impact we're expecting, and the impact overall needs to be mentioning the large-scale change we're going to make in the ecosystem. Similarly, when in the activities, when they've written food and nutrition, it does not tell us what they imply by food and nutrition. If it's going to be giving them midday meals, or it's going to be tiffin boxes, what age group is it for? Is it only for the children, or is it for the mother? So there is no clarity when we look at it, the LFA, right? And that is something that needs to be focused on. Yeah, I'll just see if there are any other questions. Would anybody like to unmute and give in their views as to what can be further improved into the LFAs?
I would like to also add, Sakshi, that when we're looking at a project plan, right, what we're essentially trying to do is just understand how the change will occur. Any organization who's working on the ground has the absolute understanding of the need of its beneficiaries. They understand what is the need of that community. They're able to design the solutions which benefit. They're able to try it out and show that change to themselves in the lives of those beneficiaries. But like I said, even in the organizational due diligence, I mentioned this. I think the challenge becomes in communicating that. So the problem is not that an organization is not doing good work, that the proposal or the project design has any gaps. It's about when you're designing, whether it's an LFA or a theory of change, when you're putting pen to paper and writing it down, any donor agency should be able to look at your activities and have a complete understanding of all you will do as part of that project. If in case for providing crutches at daycare centers, safety, nutrition and healthcare, all these activities which we've essentially mentioned here, which ABC Foundation have mentioned, say there are even activities before that, hiring people, procuring, conducting a need assessment. Those are also activities which ideally should be mentioned in the LF. Similarly, and those activities also have outputs. Conducting a need assessment also has an output of number of people surveyed via the need assessment. And you can have, if I have say 1,000 beneficiary project, I can take a 500 or 600 as my sample size of the need assessment. And that can be my associated output of the need assessment being conducted as an activity. And similarly, my outcome of that may be something that, for example, sure, I'm not able to quantify. I say that conducting the need assessment allows us to identify what are the key needs and feeds into the project design overall. That is an outcome which just happened to be qualitative. Sure. I think the key idea here is that we must ensure that when we lay out a project plan for a donor, we should ensure that anybody who does not understand what you do, who potentially may not even, when they're selecting you, when your proposal goes through a due diligence exercise, may not get a chance to conduct a field visit and see you make that change occur on the ground. We need to be able to lay it out to them as a project plan with such level of detail, with such level of clarity in terms of how the change will occur, that they are able to understand and again build that trust. I would say impact efficacy, be able to predict that what you're claiming, that yes, in my scaling project, 90% of the people will receive jobs above 14 lakhs. Sure, that is the impact you want to create. But can your project plan be detailed out in a logical manner in such a way that an organization can see it and say, yes, this organization, this project plan is so detailed out with absolute clarity in its methodology to lead to those particular outcomes, to lead to that particular impact. That's what broadly what we're seeing. And like Sakshi rightly mentioned, having clearly and well-defined activities, having well-defined timelines, so we know what is the order of those activities, having quantified outputs, what amount of money we are putting in leads to what amount of output, which leads to what type and amount of outcomes. Having that very explicitly laid out also allows a donor to understand the measurement of that impact. So if you say, I will create jobs for 500 people, sure, that is an impact. However, if I say I will create jobs for 500 people, taking 1 lakh rupees from you, where they will be provided 14 lakh per annum or 20 lakh or what 14 lakh per month or 20 lakh per month jobs. Sure. What that allows them to understand is our money, our donation, our grant is leading to that quantified impact. And at the end of the day, when we're going through due diligence processes, we are actually, in most cases, in competition with other organizations, other proposals as well, right? So when it comes down to selection, if you can quantifiably prove, if you can show with absolute clarity that not only are we, not only do we have a very efficient project plan in place, but also we will be definitely able to create the impact that you see that we have designed this project for. When you're able to establish that trust, when you're able to prove yourself by data from your past work, and when you're able to lay out a well-defined and clear project plan to help explain to any donor how you will do it, that just leads to your increased chances of any proposal or any project being approved. And the way a due diligence exercise and how all these areas of proposal evaluation are structured are essentially facilitating this, broadly speaking. I just want to create a overall understanding of, when we look at a proposal plan, why really we are asking you to have quantitative outputs. Why are we asking you to have a timeline associated? But yeah, over to you, Sakshi. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so so in the interest of time, what we'll do is go to the next slide, Ashwini, please. Yeah, so over here, it's a continuation of the case study. So it'll be great if the participants could have a look at the case study, and the program budget that has been provided has been split into direct, indirect, and admin costs. So when we look at the case study says that their total budget is for 4.5 crore, which has been split into these 3 sections. Similarly, the geographical locations, what the organization has to offer includes Karnataka, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, and Punjab. So, and the reporting structure is quarterly basis and biannual update via a standard formatting report that the organization already has. So if somebody could take a, a stab at what the misalignment is between what the proposal is requesting, what the donor is requesting, and what the organization is submitting, that would be great. Please feel free to write it in the chat box as well. Okay, so yeah, you're right. So the budget that has been submitted is more than what the donor is willing to allot for that certain project. That's absolutely correct. What is also not correct in the budget is that the direct funds are 56%, whereas the indirect funds are 35%, and the admin cost is 9% altogether. So admin cost is expected to be around 5%, and that is usually the budget that we stick to. But over here, the proposal is requesting for 0.45 crore only for admin cost, which accounts for 9%. Right. Again, donor is expecting monthly report in the prescribed format, but implementing agency is offering it in a quarterly update format and on a biannual format. So there is a misalignment as there as well. Thank you so much, Rajji. Anybody else who would like to take another guess at what the misalignment is between the proposal and the donor's expectations? Okay, so if we look at the geographical locations, yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there's a difference in the geographical locations that the corporate is requesting for, and we have a different geographical locations that ABC Foundation is presenting. So they required areas of Maharashtra, Punjab, and Tamil Nadu, whereas the ABC Foundation is giving them Bangalore, Karnataka, Haryana, UP, Himachal, and Punjab.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much. So if you also look that in the case study that has been provided, they're looking at urban areas within these 3 states, right? But all the areas mentioned where the ABC Foundation is currently present, it's all it's not aligned. Not just the geographies, but also if you look at Hardoi and Baga and Kullu, these are rural areas, right? These are not urban areas. So there is a misalignment in terms of that as well. Thank you so much, Doyle. So basically, Ashwini, can we please move on to the next slide? Thank you. So when we're looking at some of the best practices and key risks, so when we're looking at the theory of change, it's not completely in sync with the components that the donor wants to focus on. Right. So it's very important to ensure that the thematic and sub-thematic requirements are in alignment with what the proposal is requesting us to present to them. Similarly, the LFA is not giving the entire picture. It's not giving a step-by-step process to how the impact is going to be arrived at. So it's the detailing should be to such an extent that wherein we're able to tell them the short-term impact, the long-term impact, the mid-term impact, so that the donor has lesser risk to flag when they're discussing the proposal with us, right? Similarly, the budgetary split is not as it should have been. 5%, 9% usually for an admin cost is considered too high. So that is something else also that needs to be accounted for when we're looking at submitting proposals and the detailed budgets. Ashwini, can we please go back to the previous slide? So if we look at the budget over here, there is no breakup cost provided. Even the line items that have been mentioned, they are not in a lot of detail, or they're not summarizing exactly what would be required for the project, right? So it's important to ensure that each and every line item is broken down to the brim. There is a rationale for each and every cost that we are accounting for, which can then be discussed during our conversations with the donors. Yeah. Ashwini, next slide, please. Next. Yeah. So again, the desired locations are not in sync. And what another component needs to be looked at is the fact that because there is no alignment in terms of geographies, the applicant, the organization has requested to build a new center in the locations that the donor wants, right? Which means that there's going to be a high capex cost, but that is not something that a donor would be willing to engage in. So these are the little components we need to keep in mind while we're applying for any form of proposal. Ashwini, next slide, please. Okay, so we'll just walk you through some of the templates that we have here. Largely, what the donors look at when they're releasing an RFP is to look at to have an overall overview of the organization, to understand what the project is going to focus on, who's going to be the SPOC, what are the compliances required, if all the certificates are available, as well as the executive summary, which is going to be a detailed description of whatever we just discussed as part of the programmatic due diligence as well. So what is the project objective? If a need analysis has been done to carry out the project at the required locations, if it's alignment with Schedule 7 of the CSR, corporate law. But also what is now upcoming and a lot of donors focus on is the SDG alignments as well. So that is something that can be kept into mind while applying for proposals. And in sections where they're requesting the alignment with Schedule 7, we can also mention the alignment with the SDG goals, with the SDGs. Okay, so the focus areas of the project: geography, target segment, mode of implementation, and timelines. So timeline is extremely important when we're submitting, and it's expected or beneficial if we are able to provide a detailed timeline, as in with a Gantt chart, right, on a monthly basis, so we're aligned with the donors as to what is expected at what time. Executive approach, project budget, project management plan in terms of which team is going to be looking after what location, how it's going to be implemented, if there's an exit plan that has been put into place. All of these components are extremely important when we're discussing when we're submitting the RFP. Next slide, please. Okay, so over here, if you see, as part of the budget over here as well, it's been split into direct, indirect, and admin costs. So it's important to provide, if you see from row G to K, column G to K, what we've done is we've given an annual budget, and then we split it according to the quarters. So quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. So what we're doing over here is that we're breaking it down as much as possible to say, okay, that this is the unit cost we're looking at, and this is why we require the unit. This is the number of units we're looking at, and this is why we require these many units. Each unit is going to cost this much, and then the further breakup, which will then account to the total cost, right? So if we break it down to each and every segment, then it's more understandable for the donor, and it's easier to have the process rolling, so that there's no back and forth in what has been accounted for, what has not been accounted for, if the the line items need to be switched between indirect cost to direct costs, etc. Right? So these are some of the templates that we have put together, and it'll be great if Ashwini, next slide, please. It's essentially, if anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to open the floor and answer. And Uday, if I missed anything, please feel free to add to it.
And I just wanted to add, so we will be doing a separate session for LFA. I can see there are a lot of questions on LFA. So just wanted to let the team know we'll do a session.
I had a question, if I may ask.
Yes, please.
Yeah. From this session, I was also looking forward to understand a little about the documentation end with the current amendments and the due diligence documentation that is required. There's definitely a long list, but what happens is the revisions of ATG, the renewal for ATG 12AB. In that cases, if you could just highlight a few examples, because that would be really beneficial for us to understand how to go about the due diligence with the new formats and the new amendments coming in, if that is possible.
So Niharika, could you elaborate on that question? So what you're essentially saying is that with changes and amendments, how should an organization be better prepared for due diligence exercises? Is that a broad question, or are you very specifically asking for the potential a recent change in, for example, the treatment of 12AB in particular? I just want to understand that.
I am referring to like the broader question, broader aspect of it, basically.
Okay, so essentially, I think the best practice we highlighted was to be to constantly be aware of these particular portals, such as the MCA portal, the website from MHA, wherein you will be provided the relevant notifications, the notices which are publicly announcing these changes should ideally be something that, whether it's your relevant administrative personnel in your organization, they should, as a best practice, it would be to ensure that those are being monitored by your organization constantly. That would be the best way to ensure that you are ready and you are aware of all the changes which are happening in the legislature. I think that's a good to have, definitely. That being said, it surely depends upon the mode of due diligence being conducted. So, for example, you may have seen that there are certain organizations which have their documents, such as 12AB, ATG, readily available for review, for download, for verification. There are other organizations which state that, yes, we have A, B, C, D, E document. And there are some organizations which do not have space for such compliance related documents, perhaps. So if I were to take an example of, say, a secondary research based model of conducting due diligence, there might be a scenario where an organization identifies that a due diligence is conducted of organization of, say, ABC Foundation, and they identify that they've highlighted they have certain documents A, B, C, D, E, and they may reach out to you requesting those documents. And upon identification, say they realize that your 12AB is not up to date. That may be a scenario where that organization, the donor agency which is conducting the due diligence, may follow up and ask you, highlighting the fact that your current document is not valid and it was subject to renewal as per the changes in, say, amendment in the Finance Act of 2020. So in that case, you're good to go, because somebody who was conducting a due diligence reached out to you, identified, to double check whether you actually have that document or not. So there's two components to this. One is related to compliance, correct, and you can ensure that you are up to date with all the notices, all the notifications, all the changes which are happening, which affect your organization. The other component is transparency. So how do you communicate that, yes, you are up to date, becomes also very important. So that is also definitely something as a best practice, which affects this particular area in particular. Because if an organization never, if a donor agency never even reached out to you and conducted your due diligence, you didn't even know, then how transparent your operations are definitely impacts, for example, in that such a mode of due diligence, particularly that. So I think I would, as a best practice, I would recommend those two components in particular, ensuring being up to date with those notifications and ensuring your organization functions in the appropriate amount of with appropriate amount of transparency as per your leadership's recommendation, as per your organization's values also.
All right, thank you.
No issues. Any other questions? I know we're also 1 minute over time. But happy to take any other questions.
Hi Uday, thanks. It was a very nice session. And a particular question related to finance. When it comes to the admin cost, I could just see that there is a direct, indirect, and admin cost you have given. Usually, like for skilling based project, which is things are like ultimately the entire cost is on human resources, right? Where you have trainers, resource people, and things like that. So is it like, for an example, the resource person who's going to go and take the training, and also like for those trainers, there are some master trainers who are actually giving the training. So where do we really try and just count these costs, which is the best practice actually?
Sure. Okay. So to reiterate, I believe the question broadly is about how, not just in particular, this example in particular, but how do we differentiate between a direct, indirect, and administrative cost? So when we're saying these three specific terms, how do we, what is the difference between all three, which allows them to identify one cost as direct, other as indirect, and lastly, thirdly, as administrative. So there are certain things to consider for any particular type of cost when you're trying to allocate them to any of these three criteria. One is whether or not that cost is directly attributable to the project. Now, in your case, you highlighted that this is the personnel. This is a personnel cost for the person who will actually be conducting the trainings.
True.
Now, that person is literally doing the key activity of the project. The key activity of the project is literally training those relevant beneficiaries. So that person's cost will be considered as direct cost because it's one directly attributable to the project. However, for example, say I were to think of the travel cost of the program manager, the person who's supposed to visit all the centers and monitor how the project is running, ensure that it's running smoothly, coordinating with all the trainers. That person's cost is also attributable to the project. But is that cost being built at a project level, or is it being built at an org level? Are they fully attributed, or is it partial cost? That program manager might be a partial cost component, for example, which is attributable to the project in particular. This project, they're attributed to their travel cost. That travel is facilitating that project's management. And you may say that is an indirect cost. However, say your administrative expense towards conducting the audit of the overall project finances. That may be certain costs, right? You pay to your audit partner, your CA, to conduct the audit of your financial utilization of that grant. Now that may be attributable. Now that may be billed at an org level and also may or may not be a partial cost. Your CA may be charging you a certain percentage. So we are not paying, the donor may not be paying the entirety of that cost. They will just be paying potentially for that very specific program's financial audit. So that is a cost attributed at an org level, which is not directly attributable. That will be considered as an administrative cost. So to recap, a directly attributable cost, which is occurring at a project level with fully allocated resources, for example, will be considered as a direct cost. A cost which can be attributed to the project, potentially even at a partial cost, and maybe a cost, a cost which is indirectly attributable, which may be a partial cost, but is being billed at a project level and not at an org level. That we are defining as indirect cost. And lastly, something which is being billed at an org level, your administrative expenses, your leadership's expenses in terms of them monitoring the program at an org level. Your partial administrative expenses might be towards those as well. Those may be considered as an administrative expense. And as you may have seen, what we would recommend as a best practice, there's no hard and fast rule, but I would say a guiding principle would be this breakup of 80 of 5 for administrative, 15 for Sakshi, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the numbers,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
5
Yeah.
for administrative, 15 for indirect,
Yeah.
and 80 for direct. That would be a potentially ideal composition for most budgets. That's just like a rule of thumb, a good to have, which is why we call them best practices and not like rules or obligations. So which may vary from project to project, and some donor agencies may have an expectation that you can't cross beyond 10%. That may be something that they define in their program criteria. And that gives you that level of flexibility that yes, our project, which is, for example, has higher level of administrative expenses due to how it's conducted, has that wiggle room to structure its budget in that manner. And hence ensure that the project design and the necessary project impact can be implemented, can occur. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So it was nicely explained. Thanks for that.
No issues. Any other questions? I'm not sure. Are we out of time or can we still
I
take
think
questions?
in the
I'm
interest
sorry.
of time, we might have to close the session.
Okay.
We've already crossed over 10 minutes, but I would request if any of you have questions, please feel free to write to us at partnernetwork@satwa.cu.in. We'll get in touch with Sakshi and Uday and make sure that we respond to your questions. So, please feel free to write to us. But thank you so much, Uday and Sakshi, for this wonderful session. I hope all of you found the session useful. Please share your feedback. We will be sharing the feedback link with you. It will definitely help us make our sessions better. So please share your feedback. Also, like I mentioned over the chat, we have also initiated a WhatsApp-based communication channel for nonprofits. And the idea is to kind of ensure on a fortnightly basis, we are sharing with them updates that are happening within the ecosystem relevant to the NGOs. This could be resources that are useful to NGOs. It could be data points. It could be changes in compliance law. So when we send you the feedback link, we'll also share the link to join our WhatsApp channel and the process to kind of do that. Request all of you to join the channel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining the session. Thank you, Uday, and thank you, Sakshi. Please follow our LinkedIn channel for further updates on the next session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.